They say the people who hurt you the most are usually the ones who already know where you hide the spare key. And I never understood how true that was until the week my 2-year-old son was fighting pneumonia and my own parents decided my beach house was the perfect place for a family vacation. Looking back now, I can still hear the soft crackle of the ocean outside and the uneven sound of Noah's tiny breathing from the back seat as I drove the last 20 miles down the coastal highway. Every few minutes I glanced into the rearview mirror, watching his small chest rise beneath his dinosaur blanket, silently praying his fever wouldn't climb again before we reached the house. The pediatrician had looked me straight in the eye that morning and said, "Keep him calm, keep him hydrated, let him rest, and avoid crowds." That was exactly why I packed the SUV before sunrise and left the city. My beach house had always been my safe place. I bought it 5 years earlier after working overtime for more than a decade, skipping vacations, saying no to expensive dinners, and putting every extra dollar into savings. It wasn't a mansion, but it was mine. A white cedar cottage overlooking the Atlantic with wide windows, a wraparound porch, and the kind of silence that made you believe the world could still be gentle. I imagined Noah sleeping through the sound of distant waves while the cool ocean air helped him recover. For the first time in days, I allowed myself to believe everything was going to be okay. As we turned onto the private road, something felt wrong. At first it was only a single pickup truck parked near the mailbox. Then another SUV came into view. Then a minivan. Then 2 more vehicles lined the gravel driveway. By the time I reached the front of the house, there were so many cars I had to stop on the grass because there wasn't a single open space left. My stomach tightened before I even turned off the engine. Loud music drifted through the open windows. Someone laughed so hard I could hear it over the ocean. The smell of charcoal and grilled burgers floated through the salty breeze. Children's voices echoed across the deck, followed by the sharp bark of a dog I didn't recognize. Noah stirred in his car seat and began coughing again, the kind of deep cough that made every muscle in my body tense. I whispered, "It's okay, sweetheart," even though I wasn't sure I believed it anymore. I stepped out of the SUV carrying his overnight bag, hoping there had to be some reasonable explanation. Maybe my parents had stopped by for lunch. Maybe a neighbor was hosting a gathering. Maybe I had the wrong day. Then the front door swung open before I could knock. My mother, Susan, threw both arms into the air with the biggest smile I'd seen in months. "Surprise," she shouted. Behind her stood my father, Richard, holding a plate of barbecue, while relatives I hadn't seen in years filled the living room, the kitchen, the porch, and even the staircase. Someone waved at me with a paper cup. Someone else yelled that the guest rooms had already been claimed. My heart sank as I counted unfamiliar faces. One after another, until I realized there were 13 relatives inside my house, smiling as though they had just arrived at the greatest family reunion ever planned. No one noticed the sleepy toddler in my arms struggling to breathe. No one asked why I looked exhausted. And in that single moment, standing on my own front porch with my sick little boy pressed against my shoulder, I realized this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was only the beginning. For a few seconds I stood frozen on the porch, convinced someone would laugh and admit the whole thing was a misunderstanding. But instead my mother wrapped me in a quick hug before turning back toward the kitchen as if she had been expecting me to help serve lunch instead of caring for a sick child. My father smiled, balancing a plate piled high with food, and said they had decided to make the most of the beautiful weather because everyone had been talking about seeing the beach together for years. I looked around the room and recognized cousins, aunts, uncles, and children racing from one end of the house to the other. Suitcases were already lined against the hallway wall. Shoes covered the entryway. Beach towels hung over my dining chairs. Someone had placed coolers in the living room, and my carefully organized kitchen counters had disappeared beneath grocery bags and paper plates. I tightened my hold on Noah as another cough escaped his tiny chest. His forehead still felt warmer than it should, and he buried his face against my shoulder without opening his eyes. I quietly asked where everyone planned to stay, hoping I had misunderstood what I was seeing. My mother answered with a cheerful laugh that every bedroom had already been assigned because everyone wanted an ocean view. She pointed upstairs and casually mentioned that she had moved a few of my things into the garage to make space for the guests. I felt my heartbeat quicken, but I reminded myself why I had come. Noah needed calm, not another stressful moment. I carried him upstairs, weaving through children running across the hallway, only to discover that even his portable crib had been folded and pushed into a closet so another family could use the room. I finally found a quiet corner in the small office overlooking the water. It was never meant to be a bedroom, but it was the only place where I could close the door. I spread Noah's blanket across the daybed, unpacked his medicine, checked his temperature, and gave him another dose exactly as the doctor instructed. Outside the window the waves rolled gently toward the shore, peaceful enough to belong in a postcard, yet inside the house every laugh, every slammed cabinet, and every burst of music echoed through the walls. I walked back downstairs and politely reminded everyone that Noah had pneumonia and needed complete rest. A few relatives nodded without really listening. Someone apologized before turning the music down only slightly. Within minutes, the volume crept back up as conversations grew louder. My father assured me everyone would settle down later, while my mother insisted children needed to enjoy summer before school started again. Standing there in my own kitchen, surrounded by familiar faces who somehow felt like strangers, I realized they all believed I was overreacting. They saw a family vacation. I saw every noisy minute stealing another chance for my little boy to recover. The afternoon stretched on, and with every passing hour the house felt less like the peaceful refuge I had worked so hard to build and more like a crowded vacation rental that everyone believed they had the right to enjoy. I tried to stay focused on Noah. Every 4 hours I checked his temperature, encouraged him to sip water, and sat beside him until he drifted back to sleep. Each time his breathing became a little heavier, I reminded myself that healing required patience. What it did not require was a living room full of shouting relatives cheering during a card game only 1 floor below him. I walked downstairs again, forcing a calm smile onto my face, and gently asked if everyone could lower their voices just a little longer. My aunt smiled politely and promised they would. My cousin nodded without looking up from his phone. Within 5 minutes another burst of laughter echoed through the house as someone turned on a portable speaker for background music. It was never one huge act of disrespect. It was dozens of tiny moments that added up until they became impossible to ignore. One child sprinted through the hallway chasing another with wet sandy feet, leaving footprints across the hardwood floors I had refinished myself. Someone borrowed my favorite coffee mug without asking. Another relative opened cabinets searching for snacks as though they had lived there for years. Every time I looked around, another boundary had quietly disappeared. The hardest part was not the noise. It was the complete absence of concern. No one came upstairs to ask how Noah was feeling. No one wondered whether he had eaten. No one asked whether I needed anything from the pharmacy or the grocery store. My son had become an inconvenience to the vacation they imagined they deserved. Late that afternoon Noah woke with another coughing spell. His eyes were glassy, and he rested his small hand against mine without saying a word. I measured his temperature again. The number was higher than I wanted to see. I called the pediatrician's after-hours nurse, who patiently reminded me to continue the medication, watch his breathing closely, and reduce every possible source of stress so his body could recover. I thanked her, ended the call, and simply stared out the office window toward the ocean. The waves kept rolling onto the shore with the same quiet rhythm they had followed for centuries, completely unaware that inside the house my patience was beginning to wear thin. Downstairs someone shouted that dinner was almost ready. A chorus of excited voices answered. The smell of grilled food drifted upstairs, followed by another loud cheer. I looked at Noah sleeping beside me and understood something that I had been trying to avoid all day. If everyone else refused to protect the peace my son needed, then that responsibility belonged to me alone, and before this trip was over I was going to make a decision that none of them would ever forget. That evening the sunlight faded into soft shades of orange across the water, and for a brief moment I hoped the house would finally grow quiet. Instead, dinner turned into another celebration that seemed to become louder with every passing minute. Folding chairs appeared across the deck, more coolers were opened, and someone joked that this was already becoming the best family getaway in years. I carried Noah downstairs only long enough to warm a bowl of soup because I wanted him to eat while it was still warm. His little face looked pale, and his energy was almost gone. He leaned against my shoulder instead of asking to play, something no healthy 2-year-old ever does. Before I could reach the microwave, one of my younger cousins rushed through the kitchen and nearly bumped into us. She apologized with a quick smile before running back outside without noticing that Noah had started coughing again. I finally settled him at the small breakfast table, hoping he would finish a few spoonfuls, when my mother walked in carrying a serving tray. She looked at Noah for barely a second before smiling at me. "He looks much better already," she said. "Fresh ocean air fixes everything." I quietly explained that the doctor had warned us pneumonia could become serious if he did not get enough rest. She waved her hand dismissively and answered, "Children bounce back. You worry too much." Before I could respond, another relative stepped into the kitchen and asked where the extra blankets were stored because several people wanted to sleep over another night. Another night. I had assumed everyone would leave after dinner. Instead, they had already decided to extend their stay without asking me once. My father joined the conversation and casually mentioned that everyone had taken vacation days, so it made sense to enjoy the beach for as long as possible. I stared at him, waiting for him to realize what he had just admitted. They had planned this entire trip around my house without ever thinking to include me in the decision. At that exact moment Noah began another long coughing spell. The room fell silent for only a heartbeat before conversations picked up again as though nothing had happened. Someone asked where the dessert plates were. Someone else wanted to know if there was enough ice for tomorrow. My son struggled to catch his breath while people debated breakfast plans. I carried him back upstairs, closed the office door, and sat beside him until his breathing settled again. As I brushed the hair away from his forehead, I realized I had spent the entire day asking for understanding from people who had already decided my concerns were less important than their comfort. Something inside me shifted. I stopped wondering how to convince them to respect my home, my child, or my boundaries. Instead, I began wondering how quickly I could take back control of every one of them. I barely slept that night. Every couple of hours I woke to check Noah's temperature, listen to his breathing, and make sure he was resting comfortably on the small daybed. Between those quiet moments I could still hear muffled laughter downstairs, footsteps crossing the hallway, doors opening and closing, and the distant hum of conversations that never seemed to end. Just before sunrise the house finally became silent, but instead of feeling relieved I felt something else entirely. The silence gave me room to think, and for the first time since arriving I stopped reacting emotionally and started thinking practically. This house had always been equipped with a smart security system. Every exterior door, every electronic lock, and every access code could be managed from an application on my phone. I had installed it years earlier after buying the property because I often traveled alone with Noah and wanted the extra peace of mind. I opened the application almost absent-mindedly while sipping a cup of coffee beside the kitchen window. Every registered access code appeared on the screen exactly as I remembered. My own permanent code. The temporary guest code I occasionally shared with trusted friends. Emergency backup settings. Everything was there, waiting for a decision only I had the authority to make. I closed the application without changing anything. Not yet. I wanted one last chance to believe my family would recognize how serious the situation had become. Around 8 o'clock people slowly wandered downstairs talking excitedly about spending the morning shopping in the nearby beach town before returning for another cookout. My mother cheerfully asked if I wanted to join them. I explained that Noah was still running a fever and needed complete rest. She smiled sympathetically but quickly shifted the conversation toward restaurant reservations and souvenir stores. My father announced that everyone should leave together so nobody became separated in weekend traffic. Listening to them organize another full day of vacation activities while my son struggled through his illness felt strangely unreal. Before everyone headed outside, I calmly said that I needed the house kept quiet when they returned because Noah had barely slept. Several relatives answered with quick promises that sounded polite enough, but I had heard those same promises the day before. They meant well, yet nothing ever changed. One by one they climbed into their vehicles, laughing, waving, and discussing where to stop for breakfast. I watched from the front porch until the last vehicle disappeared around the bend in the road. The property became wonderfully still. The only sounds left were the rolling waves and the seabirds gliding above the shoreline. Noah remained asleep upstairs, breathing more peacefully than he had since we arrived. I looked back at the empty driveway, opened the security application once again, and this time my hand did not hesitate. I created a brand new master code that only I knew, permanently deleted every temporary access code, disabled every shared credential, and confirmed each change one by one. The application displayed a simple message when the process finished. Every exterior lock had been successfully updated. I slipped my phone into my pocket, took a slow breath, and realized I did not feel guilty. I felt calm, because for the first time since we reached the beach house, I had finally begun protecting the one person who depended on me more than anyone else in the world. The next morning felt completely different from every day that had come before it. Sunlight spilled across the hardwood floors without being interrupted by hurried footsteps or piles of beach bags scattered across the hallway. I prepared breakfast in a quiet kitchen, and for the first time since arriving I heard Noah laugh at something as simple as a seagull landing on the deck railing. His fever had begun to come down overnight, and although he still tired easily, there was more color in his cheeks and more curiosity in his eyes. Watching him point toward the waves while holding his small cup with both hands reminded me that I had made the right decision, no matter how uncomfortable it had been. Around mid-morning my phone buzzed with a single text message from my father. There were no accusations and no demands. He simply asked if we could talk whenever I felt ready. I did not answer immediately. Instead, I spent the day exactly as I had intended from the beginning of the trip. Noah and I walked slowly along the nearly empty shoreline, stopping every few minutes whenever he wanted to collect another smooth shell or watch tiny sand crabs disappear into the wet sand. We never wandered far from the house because he still needed plenty of rest, but every quiet minute outdoors seemed to restore a little more of his strength. That afternoon, after Noah had fallen asleep again, I finally called my father. His voice sounded older than it had only 2 days earlier. Before I could say anything, he apologized. Not with excuses or explanations, but with simple words that carried more weight because they were honest. He admitted that he and my mother had become so excited about gathering the family that they stopped seeing the situation through my eyes. He said they had convinced themselves that because everyone meant well, the impact did not matter. I quietly answered that impact was exactly what mattered. Noah had needed peace, and instead he had been surrounded by constant noise. I had needed support, and instead I had been expected to adapt inside my own home. My father listened without interrupting. When I finished, he admitted that watching everyone stand outside those locked doors had forced him to recognize something he should have understood from the beginning. Owning a home does not simply mean possessing a building. It also means having the right to decide who enters it and when. Before ending the call, he asked if I would ever forgive them. I looked toward the bedroom where Noah was sleeping comfortably with his favorite stuffed bear tucked beneath one arm. I told him forgiveness was never the difficult part. Rebuilding trust always took longer. He quietly said he understood. After we hung up, I placed my phone on the table and stepped outside onto the porch once again. The ocean breeze carried only the sound of rolling waves, and in that peaceful afternoon I realized that sometimes the strongest families are not the ones who never make painful mistakes. They are the ones willing to face those mistakes honestly after the silence finally allows everyone to hear the truth. 3 days later, the doctor smiled as he listened to Noah's lungs and told me the infection was finally moving in the right direction. We still needed to finish every dose of medicine and take things slowly, but the worst was behind us. Relief washed over me so quietly that I almost did not recognize it at first. For nearly a week, every decision I had made revolved around protecting one small boy who trusted me completely, and now I could finally see that those difficult choices had given him exactly what he needed most. Before leaving the beach house, Noah insisted on carrying a tiny bucket filled with the shells we had collected together during our peaceful walks. Looking at that little bucket, I realized it held more than seashells. It held memories that almost never happened because I had nearly allowed guilt to become stronger than common sense. A week after returning home, my parents asked if they could visit. This time they did not announce plans or invite anyone else. They asked what day worked best for us and whether the visit should be short so Noah could continue recovering. When they arrived, they came carrying homemade soup, fresh fruit, and a children's picture book they thought Noah might enjoy. My mother hugged me gently before apologizing once more. She admitted that she had spent several nights replaying everything that had happened and finally understood how lonely I must have felt while trying to care for a sick child surrounded by people who kept treating the situation like a vacation. My father quietly handed me the spare emergency key I had once given him years earlier. He said he wanted me to keep it unless I chose to trust someone with it again someday. I slipped it into a kitchen drawer without saying much because his gesture spoke louder than another apology ever could. The afternoon passed peacefully. Noah proudly showed his grandparents every shell he had collected, and they listened with genuine attention as though each one were a priceless treasure. There were no loud conversations, no unexpected guests, and no assumptions that my home belonged to anyone except the people living inside it. When they prepared to leave, my father paused at the front door before turning back toward me. He thanked me for locking them out. The words surprised me enough that I laughed softly. He explained that sometimes people only recognize a boundary after they are forced to stand on the wrong side of it. As their car disappeared down the street, I closed the door with a heart that felt lighter than it had in a long time. Families are never defined by perfect moments. They are shaped by the lessons they are willing to learn after painful ones. I once believed protecting the people I loved meant always opening the door. Now I understood a quieter truth. Sometimes the greatest act of love is knowing exactly when to close it, because the people who truly care about you will eventually return, not demanding the key, but earning your trust all over again.